Hello everyone, Eric Rosenbach here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It's cold and gray outside, but we're here. And the first thing I wanted to do is thank you for taking the class. I know that you're now at the very end of your 8-week short course. You've done a lot of work, working on the way through from how the internet works to learning about the threat, some ways to identify critical assets, all the way through to the much more high-end, kind of complicated things about holistic mitigation of risk, including insurance and litigation, all of those type things. And the whole way through, you've been working on your plan for either your organization or the North Korea case with Sony. So I'm just super appreciative that you've hung tough through everything. I think you all know I purposely made this a pretty tough class so that you would learn a lot and take a lot out of it. And I'm grateful to all of you for taking it and working so hard. The second thing that I wanted to say is that I apologize for last week. We had a session like this originally scheduled. I was sitting here in the chair in the studio in the basement of the big library here at Harvard, and we were not able to deliver. As we did the forensics in the end, we figured out it was a service problem outage with YouTube that eventually kept us from reaching you. And so we rescheduled it because I feel very strongly about wanting to be able to interact with y'all and answer your questions. So sorry about that, but we're back up and should remind you, just like you learned in class, always have a good incident response plan. In this case, there's nothing we could have done since it was YouTube that was down, not us, but you got to keep that in mind. So that brings us to today and what I'd like to do. You know, throughout the course, I have no chance or opportunity to interact with you all directly, which is something that, as a teacher, is a shortfall in the class. In my live class here at Harvard, where I teach every Tuesday and Thursday, you know, I'm able to interact with the students, mentor them, answer their questions during the course of the lecture or Socratic method in the way I do it. And I just wish there was some way to do that more often in the online class. So for at least for this one time, I wanted to be able to interact with you, answer your questions, and kind of address the things that are on your mind. And so here's the way I'd like to do it. I have some preset questions that people sent in, but what I think would be better is I see people now logging in and giving their comments. So for example, I see Daniel from Zurich, Luca from Italy, Fernando from Chile, Alicia from California, even someone from good old Boston right here, Wickus from Cape Town, is if you could go ahead and send me the question you have, I'll look here online and see what you're asking and then be able to give some thoughts on it and then maybe see what others in the class think as well so that we have some interactive dynamic. And I would really appreciate that. You can ask anything you want, from things that are more relevant to the private sector, a question specifically about class and the material, or if you're interested in things going on in the policy world, some of the things that I may have worked on during the previous administration in some of those hard cases, anything wide open, and I'd be happy to answer. So I see the first question, it looks like, is from Christian, who's from Hamburg. And Christian's question is, do you see the liability model changing? Will a company be able to hold a software or services vendor liable for the consequences of bad programming? I think this is a pretty good question. So, you know, when I'm talking to my students here at Harvard, the thing that I emphasize to them is you need to go through different modes of analysis. And so as a starting point for this is a question really about the law and litigation. So to start with, you differentiate between when you're thinking about the US model, where there's a lot of litigation, or the European model, where, as Christian knows, in Germany, a lot less litigation. My wife is a German-trained attorney, originally from Augsburg, and so we often talk about those two different models. Here's my answer. In the US, I think unless there's a major change in legislation, that we're unlikely to see a software or service provider held liable for a major cybersecurity flaw. That's on the current path, I'd say. However, you know, in the past, I had even worked on trying to push some legislation that would hold software providers or service providers more accountable for underinvesting in the security of their products. And you can see that starting to catch on a little bit more, in particular with the Internet of Things. There are a couple bills in U.S. Congress right now that would hold the producers of internet-enabled devices for IoT accountable for lax security. After the DDoS attack, there was a lot more talk about that too, because essentially a well-known vulnerability or preset passwords were responsible for creating a big botnet that was then used for a denial of service attack. I'd say in Europe, on the one hand, that seems unlikely, only because there's not a lot of litigation there. On the other hand, though, the Europeans have been the thought leaders in terms of thinking about GDPR, which now, of course, is in effect, or improved policy protection and holding social media firms like Facebook more accountable for that. So we'll see, but I think the bottom line answer, Christian, is in general, I don't see the liability model changing a lot. Okay, let's see. The next question, this is from Roberto, who's in Berlin, another question from Germany. And thank you to the Germans. It's at least 9 p.m. there. I can't remember how things work with daylight savings change, which just happened this weekend, but a little bit later there. And the question from Roberto is, what would be a good strategy to hire and retain personnel in cybersecurity firms with businesses and startups? So I'm going to tell you a little bit about an experience I have on this that is from the government to start with, and then extrapolate that to the private sector. You know, when I first got to the Department of Defense as an appointee, and this was 2010, 2011, we were just establishing Cyber Command and trying to figure out how to get really qualified, talented personnel there in Cyber Command. So this exact same question that a lot of private sector organizations are dealing with right now, we were trying to figure out with there. In the case of Cyber Command, it was a little bit different because we knew that the mission was so interesting that if we got people in and got them trained and we got them up to the standard of Cyber Command and NSA, they were more likely to stay. But the idea that you have to think about is, first of all, you want to recruit, and then you want to train, and then you want to retain. So if you think about those three things, recruit, train, retain, I think that's the best model. The alternate model would be that you recruit people who are already experts, and then you pay them a lot of money and you try to retain them too. In my experience, that's not as good a model. So in Cybercom, we recruited people not based even on fancy credentials, right? So maybe that sounds a little unusual from someone who teaches at Harvard. I went here for school at one point. But we're looking for people who had aptitude and a desire to learn certain cyber skills, would put them through all of this training in the military services and in the National Security Agency, and then give them a mission, and that mission was what would retain them. We found that to be pretty successful, and the rate of people leaving, even if they could go earn 4 or 5 times the amount of money in the private sector that they could in government, it kept them in because the mission was important. So that's where I think you have to think about it more in the private sector is, what are you doing to keep highly qualified cyber talent intellectually engaged? You know, because a lot of you have a background like this too, most often you can find a job where you make more money or maybe you have a better quality of life. The thing that holds people in is a good mission and good management and good leadership, right? So if you can work on those things, I think you're most likely to be successful. Okay, so let's see. Next, I'm gonna ask or take a question from, this is Christian here from Boston. All right, Christian Donoso. Please comment on the impact of quantum computing and what that may bring to cryptography. Pretty interesting question. So again, I'm going to start by relating a little bit to my experience in the Department of Defense, where we would commission the intelligence agencies to do short, medium, and long-term looks at the future of quantum computing because we were so concerned about the potential that a nation-state adversary with quantum computing, true quantum computing capability, would be able to attack our encryption. And remember, the Department of Defense is the biggest user of encryption in the world. Again, this may sound a little bit strange, but I'm a diehard believer in strong encryption and not having backdoors to encryption, even though there are a lot of national security reasons that you might want that. And it's because you need strong encryption to protect the good guys too, right? Those people, both citizens and think about people conducting operations in the Department of Defense. So back to the issue of quantum computing, you know, in theory, the idea is that if you had true quantum computing and you were able to use that processing power, you could attack the algorithms and the math that underlie some of the most important algorithms for encryption and be able to break into it in a way that right now would be mathematically impossible. The truth is, I think true quantum computing probably is still pretty far down the road, and I know there's some big efforts focused on that. So I'm not too worried about it, but if it does happen, and it were someone that had interest opposed to democracies, not just the United States, but it could be Europe, Latin America, Asia, other places, democracies, that could be a pretty significant thing in terms of privacy and protecting information that you want to be protected by strong encryption. Okay, so let's see. Next, I'm going to try to go to another part of the world. This is Manohar from India. And Manohar even put India in parentheses in Asia. Good thing I've been to India, know what it's all about, even worked with them on some cyber stuff. Manohar, I think it must be like, 10.5 hours. It's like 1:30 in the morning, 2 o'clock there. So good for you staying up late. What efforts were done by 38 U.S. states to counter threats, to sow doubts? The entire election is manipulated apart from $38 million in spending for the assessment of vulnerabilities. Okay, this is a great question. This is one that's pretty near to my heart, Manohar. So in one of the biggest democracies of the world, you know that trust in voting systems and election is really important. And I'll tell you all a little bit of a backstory about why I care a lot about this topic. In my last job in the government before I came back to the Kennedy School, I was the chief of staff at the Department of Defense. So I was working for the Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter at the time. And it was the summer of 2016. And by virtue of being at that part of the organization, you know, you're up near the very top, I was reading all of the intelligence reports as they came in, talking about how the Russian intelligence services, directed by Vladimir Putin, were going to make a concerted effort to try to influence the outcome of the 2016 elections in the United States. It was also clear from the intelligence that they were trying to favor one of the candidates over the other. And the truth is that from the national security perspective, I didn't really care which candidate was going to be favored. It was just the idea that the Russians were attacking American democracy, the very heart of our country, that had me upset. And you know, the truth is, I have to say, the Obama administration that I was a part of that team, I don't think responded in a way that was forceful enough. And my concern has always been since then that all of the other bad guys around the world, whether some crazy domestic actor in the United States or the Iranians or the North Koreans, would look at that weak response and try to go after U.S. elections, either in the midterms, which are tomorrow in the United States, or the 2020 presidential election. And so the question was, what else has been done? And Manohar mentioned an amount of $380 million, which is what Congress approved for the states to improve the cybersecurity of their election systems. Now remember, in the United States, it's a federalist system, and in the Constitution, it's very firmly established that the states, each one of the 50 states, runs their own election infrastructure, not the federal government. So this means there's $380 million of money, peanut butter spread across 50 states, each of them able to use it to improve it, which is helpful, but definitely not sufficient when you think about you know, just how much it costs to maintain these systems, upgrade them. And so what I've been working on here at the Kennedy School is a project over the last year and a half just focused on trying to protect a digital democracy. And maybe interesting to some of you, I talked to Hillary Clinton's campaign manager, Robbie Mook, who's on the team, Mitt Romney, a former Republican presidential candidate, his campaign manager on the team, Alex Stamos, the chief security officer for Facebook, same for Google, Dmitry Alperovich from CrowdStrike, just this interesting group of people who all wanted to work on this problem. And what we've done are very practical things. We created a playbook for state and local election officials to improve their cybersecurity, another one for campaigns Probably one of the most interesting things we did last year in the spring, so this was just this past spring in 2018, invited state and local election officials from 42 different states that came to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and we ran them through a military-style simulation exercise in which they had to play different roles of an election and a simulated attack, both cyber and information operations, by the Russians to see how they would respond. And of course they failed. That's what you do in this type of exercise. But they learned, and then we taught them some of the things they could do to mitigate that risk, just like in class. Very holistic. It's not just about the technical stuff. It's about the human dynamic and the leadership dynamic. And then we taught them how to do the simulation so they could go back to their states and do the same thing. So the idea was we were hoping that we make just some little difference in preparation for the midterm elections that are tomorrow. And we've seen some evidence that the Russians may be going after the midterms, and maybe the North Koreans or the Iranians as well, too. So fingers crossed that nothing bad happens. And that's something that I think applies equally as much to a country like India, a giant democracy, although their voting systems are, I think, more secure than in the United States from everything I understand. It's something that's a threat to democracies everywhere. Okay, good. So let me see. I'm going to look back on here and say, let's see. Okay, this is from Carmine Clementelli in the USA here. And it says, as cloud security failures will also be the organization's fault, do you think cloud infrastructures are, let me look here for a second, are secure enough or organizations need to check cloud security postures and configurations? Okay, great question, Carmen. This is what I'd say. Maybe I'm, an iconoclast, but when it comes down to it, I believe that your data is going to be much more secure in the cloud with a professional cloud services provider hosted there with the cloud than an organization trying to run their own IT. Now, there could be differences. A big financial sector firm that has, $1 billion cybersecurity budget every year may be an exception to that. But in general, going to a cloud services provider, I think, is the best thing to do. Now, Carmen has a good point, though. That doesn't mean that if you're the one responsible for the security of the data, just because you've signed a contract with the cloud services provider, that you can kind of like wash your hands of responsibility. It means, first of all, in the contract, and we talk about this in class a little bit, that there need to be specific provisions that would allow you to check the level of cybersecurity and even service level agreements. So if there's a connection with a third-party vendor or others, that you have a way to try to mitigate that risk. So going to the cloud, I think, is a good thing. However, you need to make sure you are focused on that. And then just one more point to bring it back to the other topic about defending a digital democracy. We're also looking a lot at the cybersecurity of campaigns, political campaigns, for obvious reasons, because some of the major hacks in 2016 were against campaigns, and Secretary Clinton's in particular. One of the pieces of advice we give them is go to the cloud, use Google or someone else, Microsoft and Azure, to host your IT. They will definitely be more secure than a small startup campaign organization or firm trying to put all that together and defend themselves. And in this case, you'd be trying to defend yourself from the pointy tip of the Russian GRU, their Russian military intelligence organization. That's not something that a small campaign or firm is ready to do. Google, Microsoft, however, they're ready to do that. So you'd be in better hands. Okay. Let's see. What else do we have here that is interesting? Okay. I see a pretty interesting question from Emma Cyber. Emma doesn't say where she's from, but must be somewhere out in cyberspace, given her last name, which is, how could we better overcome the argument that we don't have money for that, especially in the public sector, as I see all the good tech people leave for the private sector? That's a great question, Emma. Here's one tactic that I think will be helpful. It's this. I assume you're talking about non-defense, because in Department of Defense, national security, usually there's a lot of money for this stuff and you're able to keep good people. In the rest of the government, though, in the public sector, it can be very dispiriting. And I would remind senior leaders in the public sector that allocating resources is important because otherwise they just might get fired. And they do not want to lose that cush government job. And one thing you could do in particular that might be interesting, in my class here at Harvard, I show the YouTube clip of the director of the Office of Personnel Management testifying before Congress, trying to explain, in this case, why she hadn't focused more on cybersecurity for the Office of Personnel Management. It's so painful to see this hearing and to see her trying to explain why they underinvested, didn't make it a management priority. So there's one idea. Emma, maybe you can like show that clip to your boss and say, do you want this to be you? That seems like it'd be pretty painful. That might be a little in her or his face, but you know, I think would be effective anyway. Great, okay. Oh, that's Emma from France. Good, calling in from Europe, from French. Thank you very much. Okay, this, let's see. This is a question from Carl, who says, without giving away the keys to the kingdom, what has Harvard implemented to protect its networks, systems, and data? Okay, and Carl's from New York State. I won't give away the keys to the kingdom, but the good news is there's some pretty basic things that Harvard has done in the last several years that I think are important. And so, you know, Harvard is a massive university. If you think about Harvard Law School, Harvard Medical School, the research laboratories, just Harvard Medical School runs, I think, 3 or 4 major hospital chains in the Boston area. This is a big operation. You know, maybe I'll get in trouble for saying this. In the past, Harvard has not had super cybersecurity. There were times in the past when in the Department of Defense, we would recognize that there were bad guys on Harvard's network that were using it as infrastructure to conduct attacks other places in the US. So, you know, we gave them a hint and they worked on that. I think one of the most important things that Harvard has done is in-access control, right? So on the one hand, you need to have pretty free-flowing access because there are lots of students. You want it to be an open environment. You want them to be able to use their laptop, you know, in Harvard Yard here where they'll all sit out on a nice day. On the other hand, you want to make sure that bad guys aren't using that access to get to key infrastructure or data. And two-factor authentication has been a really important addition to what Harvard does. Harvard uses Duo, which I think works very well from my perspective, and I think has made a pretty big difference. Also, there's a lot of role-based access, and you all know what that is from class. Essentially, you're identifying roles where certain people should have access to certain information and others not. Those two things I think have made a big difference, in addition to just locking down Harvard-issued laptops to make sure people can't install software. That has a lot to do with preventing the spread of malware. Okay, great question. Let me get a little water here and then see what we can come up with next. All right, let's see. All right, I'm gonna scroll back up here. Y'all keep the questions coming. Okay, this is from Gustav Lipman in New York City. Will a catastrophic event initiate real security from a malicious Internet of Things attack? Okay, so let me make sure that I understand this right. I think that the idea here, I think, Gustav, and you tell me if I don't get it right, is that you want to know if it's going to take a big attack to actually bring more security, you know, writ large, including to the Internet of Things. And you know what? I hate to say this, but right now, there are some crazy things going on that people know about in cybersecurity, right? So for example, to me, it's really hard to stomach the fact that we know that the Russian intelligence service has malware in the United States electric grid that's the exact same malware they used to take down the grid in Ukraine twice. That seems crazy to me that we're not doing more about that. And so when I think of that as an example, I'm afraid that it probably will take some type of big catastrophic attack before there really is a change in terms of cybersecurity standards or some type of regulation. But here's the part that I worry about even a little bit more, Gustav, is that You know, sometimes the reaction to a catastrophic attack can be worse than the attack itself. And now in particular, for certain reasons, I would be very nervous that a big cyber attack would result in much more pervasive government surveillance of the internet in the United States, or certain things that would violate the Fourth Amendment and maybe the First Amendment going on too. You know, so clearly I don't want there to be a big attack, and I'm even more fearful that the government itself, not just in the US, but in other places around the world, could use something like that to advance things that could be very harmful to a democracy. So it's both that and the secondary effect that I worry a little bit about. Okay, let's see. Okay, I see interesting question here. This is from Jonah Schnell. I'm scared to death about a hack on a company that authenticates biometric information like retina scans, fingerprints, for others such as financial services companies. I think this is a great point. I've thought about this too. I travel quite a bit, and so I use Clear, one firm, that does this biometric capture so that you can get through line. And on the one hand, I love tech, and so I generally trust tech. On the other hand, it's occurred to me that with some of this biometric data, if one of those firms were hacked, that could be very bad. Here's another example. I just talked about the hack of the Office of Personnel Management, which holds all of the security clearance files for people like me who've been in government and national security organizations, have a top secret clearance. There's biometric data included in that as well. So it just goes without saying, the hack of biometric data could then be used to create a fake fingerprint, maybe a fake iris, other things like that that are used by financial services as a second or third form of authentication when we're talking about two-factor authentication, et cetera. That could be pretty problematic. So you should not doubt at all that sophisticated nation-state intelligence services like the Chinese or the Russians in particular would target a firm like that that's holding biometric data and try to figure out something to do with it. Okay. So let's see. Okay, the Jonah's there in California. All right, let me see. This is a question from Paul in Hartford that says, should the ISPs take a greater role in the overall defense of our infrastructure? And so, good question, Paul. Remember, ISPs are the internet service providers. And this, I think, is something that has been debated now probably for at least the last decade, and maybe even before. I told you all a little bit my background, and you can read from my bio, but I got started in all this stuff working as an intelligence officer at a small NSA post and, collecting telecommunications intelligence. After that, though, I was the chief information security officer for a big internet service provider, and remember thinking all the time about what my responsibility as being in charge of the security for that internet service provider was to stop bad things we saw on the network. Way back then, this is almost 15 years ago, there wasn't very much of a responsibility. And the thing that is a little problematic now is I don't think the internet service providers and telecoms in general still feel any sense of responsibility to stop a lot of bad stuff on their network. Now, you have to remember that would be very tricky even from a legal perspective. If they were doing deep packet inspection and trying to eliminate malware, operationally there would be an impact, and also in terms of Fourth Amendment, First Amendment rights, you could see lawyers having a heart attack. When I was in government, we did work with internet service providers to try to find ways within the law and within an acceptable spectrum of political risk to do things that would block malicious traffic from denial of service attacks or malware. And it was pretty complicated. So the bottom line is, I think a lot of internet service providers recognize that security as a service is something that they can make money off of and are positive, but they are very rarely willing to do something just because it is the right patriotic thing to do, right? There needs to be a financial incentive, which I think is fine when you have all those things put together. Okay, let's see. Fine. Okay, this is from Fernando, who asks, what are the main cyber threats facing a telecommunications company right now? So there are a couple things that come to mind. I would say first, and one thing that I know a lot of telcos are struggling with is the question of supply chain security. And I don't want to be sensationalist or demagogue anything, but I've worked with a lot of telecoms in the past who are struggling with the question of whether or not they should use Huawei gear, for example, or other types of hardware because of the concern that there may be things baked into that hardware or alternate access points that would allow the Chinese intelligence service to access their network. I think a telecom should be very conscious about that risk, is my personal belief, having worked a lot on cases like that. Huawei, could be Kaspersky, similar concerns, but not the only concern. I think the telcos right now need to think about their role in the future in terms of stopping distributed denial of service attacks or doing things to protect the Internet of Things, because they're going to be much more on the front lines. And then the other thing I'd say is when you think about a telco, they have their service delivery network, but then they're also, of course, a huge repository for a lot of sensitive data, either individuals or technical data, and that, of course, I think would be could be a target as well. Okay, let's look here. Okay, so here's a question from Silicon Valley. This is Peter. Hi from Silicon Valley. What do you think about China's push in Africa and cybersecurity threats in particular, especially as they provide technology to countries in the continent? This is related a little bit to what I was just talking about. So, you know, the Chinese are very sophisticated in the way that they think about advancing their influence, and in telecom has been one of these areas. Again, I don't want to sound, you know, like a hardcore national security guy, because there are a lot of ways that I respect China. I went to China for my honeymoon. My wife speaks fluent Chinese, you know, so I'm open-minded about that. But the Chinese intelligence services are aggressive, and the Chinese government has done a very good job of pushing Chinese technology out into the developing world in Africa and Latin America, and subsidizing that in a way that the US or European governments never would be able to do. So that is one way that you gain influence in a place like Africa, is giving pretty good, reliable telecom gear at cut rates, and then getting them locked in the way vendor lock-in happens in a lot of places. For people who are working in the national security space, that can be a concern. But I think it's something that you just have to be realistic about nowadays, and it's just one way that the Chinese attempt to influence local populations in Africa and other places in Asia, and have been pretty successful in doing that too. Okay, let's see. Who else do we have here? Okay, this is Luca. I don't think I took one from Luca, since Luca's there in Italy. Security tech companies describe attackers' shift in using automation, AI, etc. If this trend proves to be true, will tech, money, and infrastructure be more important than accountability and culture? Okay, this is a great question. Here's an example for me. So it may be true that there is a shift towards automation and AI for bad guys and adversaries. The Russians clearly trying to automate bot networks that are either stealing money, trying to influence Twitter, trying to do things to influence campaigns and elections. If you hear the tech companies who suffer from that, namely Twitter, Facebook in particular, you'll hear them say that we're going to fight these things with more AI. As a secondary measure, they'll say we need to invest more in people, actual analysts who would see these things and make some determination about whether there's bad going on or not. But the truth is, think back to just like a year and a half ago, not even that, a year ago, when the idea that the Russians would be doing something malicious on the Facebook platform had Mark Zuckerberg say, that's a pretty crazy idea to think that the Russians would do something to Facebook to influence the election, to what we know now about everything that the Russians and others were doing, and as a failure of organizational culture, Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook have still failed to internalize how important cybersecurity is. If you look at some of the data disclosures they've had, whether it's a hack or not, with Cambridge Analytica and others, you see the corporate culture there has been driven that cybersecurity and national security are not as high a priority as the bottom line and simply connecting people. I think in the tech community, my personal belief, having worked in and around the tech community a lot, still somewhat naive about national security threats and almost always will overemphasize the importance of technology as opposed to human leadership and management and the human dynamic. So as y'all know from class, this is something that I really try to emphasize, is that it's about human relationships. It's about being a good manager and leadership and accountability more than anything. So that's a great question, Luca, and I hope that despite what's going on, that accountability and culture probably still will be the only things that really change behavior, and thus kind of like mitigate risk in some ways too. Okay. All right. Here is a question from Vangel in Sydney, Australia. It seems like if there's anyone that far away from here, we should probably take a question. So let me ask that real quick. Okay. So here's the question from Sydney. How do you think the use of blockchain technology would affect information security? So here's my perspective. If you think about blockchain in theory, there's a great idea here, right? That you could have a distributed ledger, a network of networks, based on computing power to create blocks that are immutable and thus do a really important and underserved service of like protecting the integrity of data. That's a big idea. And because of the flaws in the way the internet was designed that didn't account for data integrity and a lot of other things that are inherent flaws in TCP/IP, I think there's something there. The problem is that, as you all probably know, blockchain is a very sexy topic right now. It's a little bit like snake oil I've seen in the past, maybe even with like public key infrastructure when everyone was talking about how PKI would solve everything, is that blockchain is good and is legit, but the number of successful implementations I've seen of blockchain are very few, and normally those successful implementations accomplish something that even a normal database could do today. So my gut tells me that in the end, the blockchain is very important, and it's a technology that will matter a lot, but that it's not here yet, and it's going to be an evolution or other evolutions of stuff that make it, a really important part of cybersecurity down the road. So, great question. Okay, all right. There's Luca saying thank you. Thank you, Luca. Let's see. All right, this is Alexandra Costa from SEA, which I guess is Southeast Asia or maybe Seattle. What would be high-level steps among the most influential and resourceful countries to reach a common agreement to reach a desired state of cybersecurity posture globally? Okay, great question, Alex. So a couple thoughts. First of all, again, I don't want to sound like, cynical American Department of Defense guy, but, when I was in my job back in the Department of Defense, one of the things I did was to negotiate along with the State Department some of these agreements with other countries, right? So often would negotiate with the Chinese on potential cybersecurity agreements. Did get one eventually with them. With the Russians, I could tell you great stories about the negotiations with the Russians that we used to have about cybersecurity and information operations. But the thing that was always very difficult, especially for those two countries, is that we would, in good faith, would put out some best practices or trying to create customary international law, some norms was what it was all about, is that the U.S. and other democracies in general would be genuine about trying to accomplish those things. However, I remember very clearly negotiating a norm with the Russians that would say, you will not attack critical infrastructure during peacetime. The Russians were all in favor of this, pushing it in the United Nations group of governmental experts. At the exact same time they were pushing that, they were hacking the U.S. election infrastructure, which was critical infrastructure, right? So these things can be very disingenuous. And the truth is, a lot of countries will conduct lawfare against the United States, which is getting us all tangled up with law and international agreements and customs and norms, because they know we're probably one of the only countries that would respect that, and other democracies as well, but certainly not the Russians or the Chinese or the North Koreans. So while I think it's a good thing, if we're talking about norms and national security, it's probably not very realistic to expect it anytime soon. So you just got to keep that in mind, I think. Okay. Let's see. I'm going to go back to Emma only because Emma's asking about, on Alexandra's question, as even the French, I think that's the French minister, argued for a multilateral approach. And I'm not sure, oh, yeah, it's the French Minister of Defense. This is Minister Le Drian. I got to know him very well along with Secretary Carter when we were working those last 2.5 years in the administration. Minister Le Drian, very thoughtful guy, helped stand up the first equivalent of a cyber command in France, and we did a little bit of helping with Minister Le Drian. But he was saying, which I think is right, that you do need a multilateral approach, and I think it's important. The United States, particularly now, would never want to be on its own in terms of taking specific cyber actions or pushing norms. The truth is, though, that's really very hard because people have very different ideas in cyberspace about what's important. Even people as close as the US and Germany or the US and France will have a very different concept of the types of actions you may want to take in cyberspace with a military organization or not. And so multilateral diplomacy, I think, is pretty complicated. Okay, let's see if we have someone else. Okay, this is Dave Roy from good old Washington, D.C. Used to live down there, great place. I don't miss it too much now, only because things are chill here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. But Dave asked, what are your thoughts on the security of open source software versus proprietary software solutions? I'm going to say this. I think it depends a lot. If you look at the security of Apple, iOS, I think that's pretty doggone secure. That's not open source. If you for example, though, look at the security of software that runs voting systems in the United States, which is proprietary, not open, I would say I am very concerned about that. And I have this crazy idea that the U.S. should launch a national initiative to build open source platforms for election voting systems, because the transparency there would be a big step forward in terms of identifying threats, the ability for people to go through and check and make sure there wasn't any malware baked inside. I think all would be good. And also the profit incentive could be mitigated in a way that probably would emphasize security and transparency more than just private sector gain. So that may not be the perfect example, but I think so. Let's see. Here's a question from Kevin in Vietnam, but let's see. I'm looking for if I can get Kevin's question. It'd be nice to take someone from Asia. Kevin, could you type that back in there? It's not coming up on the screen what your actual question was. Just see that you're there. Okay. So interesting. We have Shiri saying that open source platforms for voting are in place in Geneva. Good for me to know. So I'm going to check that out, I think, too. Okay, Emma has another question, which is, we talk about Russia and China, but at the end of the day, doesn't every state have to engage in cyber actions against one another to survive? You know, I just don't think that's true. And so here's the example I'll give. is that during the time I was in charge of cyber at the Department of Defense, we conducted offensive cyber actions fewer than, fingers on one hand, honestly. So I could count on one hand the number of times we conducted an offensive cyber operation. And that is very different than the way the Russians operate or the Chinese operate. And so I think it's really important to think about defensive cyber operations, the same type of things you guys would do if you're running a network and you're trying to defend yourself against hacks. But I think people should be very careful about offensive cyber operations, in particular if you're the United States or other democracies, because we're more vulnerable. And so every time we contemplated doing a major offensive operation, we had to think about what's going to happen when they hit us back. And that retaliatory strike against the United States or another democracy always weighed very heavily on our minds, because that could be a very hard thing given how insecure we are and somewhat brittle, to be honest. Okay, let's see. Excuse me for a sec. Let's see. And follow up to my statement, this is, I think Gord Lippman, Gustav, sorry. Do you believe there will be significant cyber disruption for the elections tomorrow? The truth is, I don't think there's going to be a major disruption. I'm a little concerned about it, but I think most of the bad guys are going to keep their powder dry until 2020. If there is a disruption, I think it's most likely to be in one specific precinct, which then would make clear that there was a hack, and Russian information operatives would try to amplify the impact of one thing like that to try to undermine trust in the democracy. That's what really this is all about. I'm just not sure that would be that effective. And luckily, I think there's some things deterring the Russians or other bad guys from doing that. However, I think it's a real possibility that a rogue domestic actor could get this new idea of using a laptop with certain type of malware on there to conduct an attack. So that would probably be, one of the worst things that could happen. Okay, so let's see. Okay, Kevin did tune in from Vietnam. Kevin says, since I'm a professional without prior cyber experience before this course, what are your recommendations on what I can do to get into this field? Honestly, I think that someone who's not an engineer or a hardcore cyber expert still has a ton of opportunity in this field. And that's because people who have a background intellectually in something that is operational or is driven by service or the bottom line will intuitively understand the business component and dynamics and why that's important, rather than just saying, I need to lock all of this down. This can't possibly go on. It's like too much of the security perspective. So I think there will be opportunities in consulting. I think anyone who is a strong manager and has enough of a grasp of cyber and cybersecurity, which all of you should, in particular after taking class for the last week, should have base understanding, will be able to do this and think through it. And, just keep on investing and learning in what you're doing. Okay. Let's see. And for Emma, for you as a lawyer, this is a great space for lawyers. I am a lawyer, probably not a real lawyer like you, and I'll still get calls from law firms all the time asking whether I want to join the practice, do something else with them, and I'm not even a real lawyer. I just have the JD and the bar, but I never practice at a firm. Okay, so we're winding up here, as y'all can tell. That's like the bottom of the biorhythm. So take another couple important questions here. Okay, let's see. This is Carl. What changes do you predict within the cybersecurity industry over the next 25 years? I think that what we're going to see coming down the road is that there will be an increased use of AI for defense, which will make a big difference. So, and let's start there. Right now, when you think about intrusion detection or some of these other heuristics-based technology, you can see it's basically a baby form of AI. As that becomes more developed, and some of these firms figure out how to really use empowered AI, that can do a lot to stop attacks because it will be predictive, not just based on signature type stuff. I think that that will be very important. Also, I think that cybersecurity in general in the next 25 years is going to get better and the industry get better because there are going to be multiple generations of people who have been working on it. I mean, this sounds a little bit crazy, but I'm one of the oldest people in the cybersecurity field nowadays, and I think I'm not that old. I'm only 46, but there's a generational gap here that is really important. If you think 25 years from now, there'll have been, at least 5 or 6 decades of people working on hardcore cybersecurity, and we'll have a lot of experience that goes into that. And then they know how to manage things. So a lot of you already have this. You're managers, you know how to manage people, and you're taking the cyber stuff just to strengthen that. But that's not the normal case with cybersecurity and tech, where people are experienced managers and then go on to something. And that can be a big impediment, I think. Okay, so let's see. I think 2 at the most questions left. Excuse me. This is Bruce Robertson, who is from South Africa, and he says, to what extent do you think cyber risk is in physical security devices like CCTV, turnstiles, and related IoT? Honestly, I think this is a pretty big problem, and the cybersecurity in a lot of IoT devices is not very strong. It's surprising to me that people have produced all of these things and still just left them wide open. So when you think about it now, there are bad guys who will hire groups of hackers to go into physical security devices so that they can shut those off so that they can then go in and conduct a robbery or some type of armed attack. And I think that trend will continue. Okay, let's see. I'm going to take one last question. See if there's one here that's really good. Let's see. You know what? I think this is what I'd like to end on because I think it's an important thing to keep in mind. This is from Christian. It says, do you think the disparity between the cybersecurity haves and have-nots will have deeper consequences for the societies we live in? And Christian is asking about the Rohingya disinformation background and other. I think, this is a really, really important point. And the question is this: in the information age, is it going to be the case that information really is power, that information and technology give power to someone? I think that's the case. And nations that have information, have invested in that technology, will be wealthier, have even more geopolitical power, right? You see these trends starting to play out where certain countries are harnessing data they have collected and using that to develop increased AI, to develop more robust systems of technology, right? The best example, of course, is China, where they even have a social credit program and massive surveillance at a physical level. All of that data collection in some ways is being fed into R&D for AI. And you can tell that a country that has that is going to be very well positioned down the road. Individuals or countries that don't have that access to data will not be as potent on the world stage. So I think pretty important thing to remember. Okay, y'all. I just wanted to thank you so much for taking the class, and hopefully you got a lot out of it. I wanted to encourage you to connect with me if you want on LinkedIn. I'd be happy to link up with you all and do what I can down the road to help out. And just want you to keep on working hard out there. Maybe it sounds a little cheesy, but in some ways you're on the front lines out there fighting against cyber threats, and it does make a difference, and what you're doing matters. So just keep fighting the good fight. So with that, I'm going to sign off. Thank you again, and hope to meet some of you in person somewhere down the road. Thank you.